to start off talking a little bit about the Kautsky family and the family tree. They're related to everybody. And Mary Rawlings is going to be showing us some pictures and talking about that family tree. And then when she's finished, I'm going to show some pictures and talk a little bit about the grocery stores. And I say stores plural because Kautskys had more than one. And then Jerry Brown is going to fill us in about the history of the basketball team, which is quite an amazing history. And I'm sure many of you may be acquainted with the story of the Indianapolis Kautskys from 1931 to 1947. They were a pretty big deal around here. So having said that, I'd like to introduce Mary Rawlings.
Hello. Hey, we're here tonight to talk about the Kautsky family. And this here is a picture of Frank and Louisa. And that was my great-great-grandparents. And this is a picture of them with their 4 children. Emma is on the your far left, and that was my grandmother. And then Frank Sr., I know, was next. Then Catherine, but she was also called Minnie. And Clara, but she was also called Molly. It gets better. Okay. So this is Frank, and he was born in 1863, and he came over on the boat from Prague. And at that time, it was Bohemia, the country. And he went to work for his Uncle Wendell building picture frames. And he did that for a while. Now, they had 10 children, so he stayed in a boarding house. And who did that boarding house belong to but Louisa's parents? And so that's how they met. And then I guess Frank decided he wanted to branch out on his own, and he got into dairy farming. And they ran a dairy farm, and then they delivered it, used to deliver your milk to you. They did that. I think about everybody on the south side did that at the time. So, well, they had 4 children. The first was Clara, or Molly. We always called her Aunt Molly. And she was married to Henry Wright. And they had one son whose name was Orrin Wright, and he was married to Ida. And they were all farmers. And they lived on the far south side of Indianapolis on County Line Road, and between Meridian and Morgantown. And their farm now is what is the Carefree Housing Edition. So they raised Holstein cattle, but then they branched out into sheep. And Orrin was, he traveled all over the world. Ida went with him at that point. And for their prize, with their prize Rambouillet and Dorset sheep. And there's an award, it's called the Orrin Wright Award. It's the highest honor given at the Indiana Sheep Breeders Association. And they were involved in the Indiana State Fair and the Johnson County State Fairs. They were past presidents of the Indiana State Fair. And we would go to visit them many times at the sheep barn at the state fair. They also were very involved in the Republican Party down in Johnson County. They had one son. His name was Nudie, and he was married and had 2 sons. And then he had since moved to Kentucky, and he just recently passed away. Okay, let's see if this is right. Did I get it right? Okay, we're on to Frank and Hazel. Frank and Hazel had one son, also named Frank H. Kautsky. Now, Frank and Louisa, that Frank was Frank Kautsky. Frank Kautsky, that so much we're here to hear about tonight, he's Frank Sr. And he's the one that owned the grocery store. And he also had a baseball team and a basketball team. And it makes us it's a little tricky for us because there are 5 Frank H. Kautskys. And I was getting mixed up because I was calling Great Grandpa Senior, but he's not. He's just Frank H. Kautsky. So the Frank Kautsky Senior had Frank Kautsky Jr., who was Franny, and then I'll go on down the line later. So Barry and Jerry are going to fill you in on what all Frank was into. And, you know, let's face it, they had 6 children. And I think Aunt Hazel was a saint to all that Frank had going on and raising six children. Now, there was a 20-year span between those 20 children, but he had Dorothy, who was married to Jimmy Johnson. She was the oldest. And Lawrence was also called Sickle. Let's see, I've got a picture. These are the 13 Kautsky cousins. And I showed this picture here because all of Frank's children are in it. So anyway, then the second child was Lawrence, but they called him Sickle. And then we had Esther, but we called her Betty. And she married John Gray. And then we had Don, and we had Normie, but we called him Red. And I'm sure many of you probably remember Don and Red at the grocery store. So all of the children did help in the grocery store growing up. Now, the third child was my grandma, and that was Emma Bixler. She was married to George Bixler Sr., and she was my grandma, and Grandpa also started out as a dairy farmer, but he also was a builder on the south side. That is the dairy when it was just the dairy. And then later they added the drive-in restaurant, Southern Circle, which I'm sure many of you remember.
Where the Steak and Shake is, or on 31?
Yeah, Steak and Shake on 31. So it was a sad day when they tore it down, but then they rebuilt it as a Steak and Shake. So then, I didn't mention, Grandpa also built all of the houses across the street from his farm, which is now Southern Plaza, on Edwards, Marks, Lawrence, and Mills. And it was right after the Depression, the Railroad Men's Savings and Loan decided that they wanted to unload a bunch of those houses, or that land. And so that was at 4200 Southeast. And so Grandpa bought the lots for $50 a piece. Okay. And then by the time World War II erupted, he had filled the lots with 2-bedroom houses, including you got a 1-car garage, 2 trees, and all the grass planted, and he sold them for $3,290. There's also an addition off of Thompson Road called Bixler Perry Park near Abraham Lincoln Grade School that he had a lot of houses built on. He also was in the gravel pit business. Let's see if I have that one. Well, I guess I don't have that one.
Question?
Yeah?
In the lower left picture, Emma and George at 4200 Southeast Street. Looks like they're in front of a house.
Well, that was when their house was there.
And
They lived, before the shopping center was built, they lived at 4200 Southeast Street, and we lived at 4250 Southeast Street.
so their address actually was 4200 Southeast Street.
Yeah.
And I would know from being the mailman for a quarter century in Southern Plaza. Address of all Southern Plaza.
Right.
Stores, and there's 4200 Southeast.
That's 4200 Southeast Street. But Grandpa's house was there, and they moved it down to Thompson Road, and they moved our house down to Bixler Road. And then we went out of town when that happened because Mom couldn't watch them move her house. So what else did I have saying? Oh, then during the eras of the 50s, I said he had built the vine. Now, Grandma, she kept the one that kept the books. So she knew where the money, okay? And the story goes, my mom remembers, Mom was going off to Purdue in 1932, and Grandma says, George, you're going to have to sell a pig. Emma's got to have some clothes to go to school. And so he did. I think Grandpa usually did what Grandma said she'd do. So anyway, Grandma passed away in 56 and Grandpa passed away in 59. And at that time, George and Frank and Emma and Ruth built the Southern Plaza Shopping Center. That was always Grandpa's dream. And so it wasn't easy because the banks didn't want to loan money for family ventures, they said. Now, they said most families couldn't get along and it wouldn't succeed. Well, I can tell you to this day, we get along. Bixlers and Kautskys and Carson and all of us. They finally found a way to turn it into the shopping center. About that time also, the federal government decides they want to put in Interstate 465. And so they wouldn't let them open an entrance to this on the south side. That's where we lived. And they, because they wanted to put that interchange in right there. And so they, anyway, worked it all out so that it could go through. Don't ask me how they worked it out. I just know they worked it out. Okay. Oh, that was the dairy farms. And this was about the shopping center. Okay, the fourth child was Catherine, but she was also called Minnie. We called her Aunt Minnie. And she was married to Bert Carson. And they had a son, Bert, who had a son, Bert. But he was called Tom. Okay. They also had twin daughters, Edna and Helen. And you might have known them as Edna Schultz, and there was Helen Lattimore. And Bud Carson, their son, let's see, I think I have a picture of that. Oh, Minnie was a realtor. She was way into real estate. And this is a picture. This is my favorite picture of great-grandma and grandpa. That's Edna and Helen, the twins, and Bud's in the middle. And that was in 1920. And this is the only picture I have of great-grandma and grandpa smiling. So that's why I like the picture so much. Okay, this is where I was talking about Carson Ford out in Brownsburg, and that's where Bud lived and with his 4 sons. And then Edna, she had 2 daughters, and even her granddaughters worked in healthcare. And then the Lattimores, we have Larry and Vivian. They were teachers in Perry Township schools. And Larry taught at what was Keystone Middle School, and Vivian taught at Glens Valley. And Vivian's here with us tonight. I hope I got that one right. Now, Vivian's son, Paul, he's also an entrepreneur, and I guess he took after Grandpa or Uncle George, it would be, because he now has a restaurant down in Bean Blossom. It's Browning's Bean Blossom Restaurant. It's on your way to Nashville, Indiana. So that was real interesting. They also had a son, Steve, and Helen had 2 daughters, Carol and Susie. When Frank Sr. passed, first wife, Hazel, passed away in 1950, he later married Lucille. And that's the great aunt I remember is Aunt Lucille. She and my mom were really good friends. They were together until his passing in 1959. Frank and Hazel, they lived, I don't really have a picture of this, but they live, you can visualize it, at the northwest corner, or is it the southwest? It's the southwest, isn't it? Corner of Shelby, no. First they lived at the northwest corner of Shelby and Kautsky Drive, just north of Edgewood Avenue. And I remember him and Aunt Lucille living in the stone house up on the hill, which is at the southwest corner of Edgewood and Shelby. And the Carsons lived on Madison Avenue, just north of Epler, and the Lattimores lived over on Whalen. So they all stayed pretty much close vicinity, those generations anyway. I tell you this so that you see that several Kautsky sons and daughters and their offspring alike were entrepreneurs in their own right and were very successful. I could go on down the line, but I doubt many of you know us further on. I will mention that Don Kautsky was most instrumental in carrying on the Kautsky supermarket as we knew it. He and his wife, Mary, had 4 daughters, Sandy, Brenda, Becky, Donis, and a son, Kim. And I know Donis and Kim were with us here tonight. He later was married to Verena. I was talking about the basketball team and the grocery store just the other day, and I had a young man ask me, how did Frank afford a professional basketball team with just owning a grocery store and a family of 6 children? And they would tell you that they didn't have a lot of money, but Frank Sr. loved his sports, and his family definitely ran the store while he pursued running the team. The 6th child's name was Normie, and he was called Red, and he worked at the supermarket until he moved to Naples in 1967. He started a Kautsky supermarket in Naples. Don't know if anyone ever visited that one.
Florida?
Yeah, in Florida. It was more of a convenience store, his daughter told me. He was also very successful in the ice business in Florida. But you know what? You need a lot of ice in Florida, so I guess that's it. Pat is the last living relative of that generation, and she is 87 years old. She lives in Naples still. There are still several cousins, second cousins, third cousins, and fourth cousins that live on the south side of Indianapolis, but many live in either sunny Florida, I've heard California, Georgia, Michigan. I try to keep track of most everyone, but it is a large family. I did start a family tree 22 years ago, and there are also some albums on the table over there and 2 books on display. And if you have any corrections or additions or something I would love to know. So it's been nice sharing with you. Thank you so much.